Picture a dimly lit room, a comfortable chair, and a blindfold. You are sitting dead center in what audio engineers call the sweet spot. Directly in front of you, hidden behind an acoustically transparent curtain, are two completely different audio systems. On the left side sits a sleek, modern $500 smart speaker. You know the type. It is a seamless cylinder of matte plastic and acoustic mesh, packed to the brim with Wi-Fi antennas, voice assistants, and highly aggressive digital signal processing algorithms. It is the pinnacle of modern convenience. On the right side sits a dusty, heavy $50 vintage receiver rescued from a local thrift store. Let us call it a Pioneer SX450 from the late 1970s, sporting a brushed silver faceplate, solid aluminum knobs, and a genuine walnut veneer cabinet. It is hooked up to a pair of basic passive bookshelf speakers with simple copper wire. No Bluetooth, no apps, no voice control. The music starts, the test begins, and within 30 seconds, the illusion of modern technological progress shatters completely. The sound coming from the $50 vintage setup does not just beat the $500 modern smart speaker. It absolutely obliterates it. The vintage system throws a soundstage so wide and deep that you can practically point to where the bass player is standing in the room. The vocals have breath, texture, and a startling human presence. Meanwhile, the modern smart speaker, when A/B tested directly against the old iron, suddenly sounds exactly like what it is. A tiny plastic box desperately trying to shout through a digital filter. This jarring realization brings us face to face with one of the greatest, most successful scams of the 21st century. The consumer tech industry has pulled off a masterstroke of marketing, convincing an entire generation that convenience equals audio fidelity. They have sold us the lie that because a speaker connects to our phone in 3 seconds and fits on a kitchen windowsill, it somehow represents an evolution in sound quality. It does not. In fact, from a purely acoustic and electrical engineering standpoint, the modern plastic audio industry has spent the last 2 decades walking aggressively backward. To understand how we got duped into trading the soul of our music for a lifestyle aesthetic, we have to look at the psychology and the actual neuroscience of how human beings perceive sound. We have to talk about something called the Fletcher-Munson curves. Now do not worry, this is not going to be a dry physics lecture. Think of the Fletcher-Munson curves as the ultimate biological hack. Through millions of years of evolution, the human ear developed to be incredibly sensitive to mid-range frequencies. Why? Because that is where the human voice lives. That is where the sound of a baby crying or a predator snapping a twig in the forest exists. We are biologically hardwired to hear the mid-range perfectly, even at very low volumes. But our ears are naturally terrible at hearing very low bass and very high treble unless those sounds are incredibly loud. Modern tech companies know this. The engineers designing your expensive Bluetooth speakers and smart soundbars understand human biology perfectly. Because they are restricted by the physical size of a small plastic tube, they cannot give you genuine high-fidelity sound. So, they use digital signal processing to hack your brain. They artificially inflate the bass and artificially boost the treble, creating what audio engineers call a smiley face equalization curve. When you first hear it in a big box electronics store, your brain lights up. You think, wow, listen to that thumping bass coming from such a tiny box. It sounds so punchy, it sounds so crisp. But that impression lasts for about 5 minutes. What the industry does not tell you is that this artificial, heavily processed wall of sound causes intense ear fatigue. By constantly bombarding your ears with unnatural spikes in low and high frequencies, your brain has to work overtime to process the audio. This is why you might turn on a modern wireless speaker while working or cooking, and after an hour, you find yourself feeling inexplicably irritated. You reach over and turn the music off, not because you are tired of the song, but because your neurological system is exhausted by the acoustic makeup being shoved into your ears. This deception is deeply tied to an ongoing crime against dynamics known as the Loudness War. There was a time, back in the era of the vintage receiver, when the physical limitations of vinyl records actually protected the music. If a mastering engineer tried to make a vinyl record too loud or put too much extreme bass into the groove, the physical needle of the turntable would literally jump out of the track. The medium itself forced engineers to preserve dynamic range, and the crucial difference between the quietest whisper of a vocal and the loudest crash of a cymbal. That space, that silence between the notes, is where the emotion of music actually lives. Then came the compact disc, promising perfect digital silence, and eventually the MP3, promising 10,000 songs in your pocket. But the industry subverted this digital revolution. Without the physical limitations of a needle in a groove, record executives and tech companies realized they could just turn everything up to the absolute maximum. They began compressing the audio signal, squashing the quiet parts and the loud parts together until the music became a solid, lifeless sonic brick. They stripped away 90% of the musical information in the name of file compression and sheer volume, operating on the cynical assumption that if a song sounds louder on a smartphone speaker, the consumer will think it sounds better. It is the acoustic equivalent of everyone at a dinner party screaming at the top of their lungs. Sure, it is loud, but nobody is actually saying anything meaningful. To really grasp the tragedy of this modern setup, we need to think of an audio signal as a delicate, pristine river. The source of this river is the original studio recording, a pure, high-resolution stream of musical data. In a true audiophile setup, the goal is to get that river to the ocean, your ears, with as little pollution and as few dams as possible. Let us look at what happens to that river when you use a modern wireless speaker. First, your phone takes that pristine stream and dams it up, compressing the data so it can be beamed through the air via Bluetooth or Wi-Fi. This immediately pollutes the river, stripping away the subtle harmonics and spatial cues that give music its life. Then, the signal reaches the smart speaker, where it is forced through a microscopic $2 digital-to-analog converter. After that, it hits a Class D amplifier chip that is roughly the size of a postage stamp. Finally, this heavily compromised, digitally mangled signal is shoved out through tiny, cheap paper or plastic drivers enclosed in a resonant plastic shell. The river has been dammed, polluted, and squeezed through a garden hose. Now, look at the $50 vintage Pioneer receiver. This machine is a wide, unobstructed, concrete-lined riverbed. When you plug a good source into a vintage amplifier, you are relying on sheer, unadulterated physics. There is no Bluetooth compression. There are no digital algorithms trying to guess what the bass should sound like. The signal flows into a massive, heavy copper power transformer. It travels through discrete, hand-soldered components, massive heat sinks, and a Class AB amplifier stage that was over-engineered to handle massive dynamic swings without breaking a sweat. When the music demands a sudden, explosive kick drum, the vintage receiver has the stored electrical current in its massive capacitors to deliver that impact instantly, with absolute authority and control. This brings us to the ultimate hardware showdown. If we were to metaphorically, or even literally, rip the lids off both of these machines, the visual contrast would be staggering. Inside the modern $500 smart speaker, you will mostly find empty space, a switch mode power supply, and a green motherboard that looks like it belongs inside a cheap laptop. The entire system relies on digital signal processing to hide the physical limitations of its hardware. It is a machine of sonic makeup. The computer inside is constantly monitoring the tiny speakers, aggressively cutting bass when the volume goes up so the cheap drivers do not literally tear themselves apart. It is a compromised system constantly fighting against its own physical inadequacy. Inside the vintage receiver, however, you find a miniature city of analog engineering. You are looking at a time capsule from the golden era of audio. In the 1970s, during the Great Receiver Wars, companies like Pioneer, Marantz, Sansui, and Yamaha were not competing on battery life, app integration, or Wi-Fi range. They were locked in a fierce, prideful battle over actual sound quality. They competed on metrics that mattered: total harmonic distortion, signal-to-noise ratio, and dynamic headroom. They built these machines using what we now call new old stock components, parts of such high quality and durability that it would cost thousands of dollars to manufacture them to the same standards today. They used solid aluminum knobs because they wanted the tactile feedback to feel like a scientific instrument. They used real glass for the radio dials. They built power supplies so robust that these machines are still functioning perfectly 40 or 50 years after they rolled off the assembly line. They built them to last lifetimes, not just until the next forced firmware update renders them obsolete. But here is where the narrative shifts from a fascinating history lesson to highly actionable advice. It is one thing to appreciate the legacy engineering of a 40-year-old heavy metal box. It is another thing entirely to actually use it in an era where our entire musical library exists on servers in the cloud. How do you bridge the gap between the analog majesty of 1978 and the infinite streaming convenience of today? How do you listen to high-resolution lossless audio on Apple Music or Spotify through a vintage receiver without ruining the signal? The answer is the hybrid hi-fi approach, and it is the absolute best budget audiophile system you can build. It is a curated strategy that completely obliterates anything you could buy at a big box electronics store, and it costs a fraction of the price. The secret lies in a modern revolution known as Chi-Fi or Chinese hi-fi. Over the last decade, highly specialized audio companies have democratized the digital-to-analog converter, or DAC. A DAC is simply the chip that translates the digital ones and zeros from your phone or computer into an analog electrical wave that an amplifier can understand. The DAC inside your smartphone or laptop is usually an afterthought, a piece of hardware that costs pennies and introduces a massive amount of electronic noise into the signal. But today, for $20 to $50, you can buy a standalone audiophile-grade Chi-Fi DAC. These tiny desktop boxes contain hyper-advanced conversion chips that, just 10 years ago, would have cost thousands of dollars. So here is the blueprint for your hybrid hi-fi setup. First, you hunt down a vintage receiver. You check thrift stores, estate sales, garage sales, and online marketplaces. You look for the heavy silver-faced monsters from the 70s or the stark minimalist black boxes from the late 80s and early 90s. You might have to buy a $10 can of electronic contact cleaner to spray inside the volume knob to get rid of a little static scratchiness, but that is part of the ritual. Next, you acquire a pair of passive bookshelf speakers. Even budget modern bookshelf speakers are incredibly capable today, but you can also find amazing vintage speakers on the used market for next to nothing. Finally, you introduce the Chi-Fi DAC. You connect your phone, tablet, or computer to the DAC via a simple USB cable. This allows your device to bypass its own terrible internal audio processing and send a pure, bit-perfect digital signal straight to the standalone DAC. The DAC flawlessly translates that high-resolution digital file into a pure analog signal. You then run a standard pair of red and white RCA cables from the back of the DAC straight into the auxiliary input of your vintage receiver. What you have just created is an audio masterpiece. You have the infinite library and convenience of modern digital streaming, processed with surgical precision by modern microchips, but amplified by the raw, unadulterated, high-current analog power of 1970s heavy metal. You get the absolute best of both worlds. The digital source provides a completely silent noise floor with no tape hiss or vinyl crackle, while the vintage amplifier injects warmth, massive dynamic headroom, and a holographic soundstage into the music. Once you have this hybrid system assembled in your room, it is time for the ultimate fire test. You cannot test a system like this with heavily compressed modern pop music. You need tracks that were engineered by masters, tracks that will push the physical limits of your amplifier and your speakers. You sit down in that sweet spot, you bypass all the tone controls, setting the bass and treble exactly to flat, and you play 3 specific iconic tracks. First, you cue up Steely Dan's masterpiece, Aja. You use this track to test the sheer width and separation of the soundstage. When Steve Gadd's legendary drum solo erupts, you close your eyes. On a cheap modern smart speaker, that drum solo sounds like it is coming from a single point in space, a muddy blur of cymbals and snares. But on your hybrid vintage setup, the room completely opens up. The speakers should physically disappear. You should be able to hear the exact placement of the hi-hat slightly to the left, the ride cymbal shimmering on the right, and the kick drum punching you squarely in the center of your chest. The separation between the instruments should be so distinct that you feel like you can walk between them. Next, to experience true, uncompressed dynamic range, you play Dire Straits' Telegraph Road. This is a 14-minute epic that tests the noise floor and the headroom of your heavy iron receiver. The track starts incredibly quietly, almost a whisper of a resonator guitar and a low synthesizer drone. On a bad system, you will turn the volume up just to hear the beginning, and then when the song eventually explodes into its massive, soaring guitar crescendos, it will distort and hurt your ears. But on the vintage amplifier, you set the volume once. As the song slowly builds, the amplifier maintains absolute clarity in the quiet moments. And when the massive dynamic shifts occur, the massive copper transformer delivers the current effortlessly. The music swells from a whisper to a roar without a single hint of harshness or distortion. It is a physical wave of sound that washes over you, proving why dynamic range is the lifeblood of musical emotion. Finally, you test the absolute physical grip your amplifier has on your speakers by playing Massive Attack's Angel. This track is infamous in audiophile circles for its deep, menacing, subterranean bass line. We are not looking for the sloppy, bloated, artificial bass that modern Bluetooth speakers pump out to impress teenagers. We are testing something called the damping factor, the amplifier's ability to start and stop the woofer cone with absolute authority. When the bass drops in Angel, the vintage receiver takes control of the speaker drivers like a vice grip. The bass should not boom or linger. It should hit with a tight, terrifying precision that vibrates the floorboards while leaving the delicate high-frequency percussion floating cleanly above it. Experiencing music this way changes you. It rewires your expectations. Once you hear the breath of the vocalist, the decay of a cymbal crashing in a real acoustic space, and the visceral punch of an uncompressed kick drum, you can never go back to the plastic convenience of a smart speaker. You realize that music was never meant to be background noise, compressed into a digital brick and piped through a microscopic tube while you wash the dishes. The consumer tech industry almost succeeded in making us forget what real music sounds like. They almost convinced us that physics could be replaced by algorithms, and that legacy engineering was just a heavy, inconvenient relic of the past. But the heavy iron is still out there, waiting in thrift stores, basements, and pawn shops. It is waiting to be rescued, dusted off, and plugged back in. Building a hybrid hi-fi system is not just about saving money, though it will save you thousands compared to buying high-end modern gear. It is a philosophical rejection of disposable technology. It is a refusal to accept the acoustic makeup and the loudness wars. It is a decision to stop consuming disposable noise and start experiencing the history, the breath, and the pure, unfiltered emotion of real music again. The components are out there. The blueprint is in your hands. It is time to go find your heavy iron, plug it in, and actually listen.